Okay, welcome to Marx and Philosophy, lesson held by Ray Brassier. And this is session one of a total of eight sessions. And I'm going to pass the mic to Ray directly.
Okay, hi. So first, can everyone hear me okay? Hello? Yep, can everyone hear me?
Yes, yes, sir.
Okay. Excellent, okay, great. And I'm not sure if, is the camera working or is there any image at all? Yeah, there is, okay. Great, fine, okay, I'll just get going. So I've sent a handout which I don't know if it's been forwarded to you already or if it's possible to kind of, to put it up. Does everyone have, can everyone see the handout?
Just checking my email right now.
Okay.
It's there.
Okay. Right. Is anyone still not able to access the handout or see it?
I don't have it because I wasn't put in the email group. So
okay.
Yeah. I think Artem's sending it to me. Yep, I've got it.
Okay. Well, look, in the meantime, I'll say a few preliminary words. Well, basically, I'll introduce the session. So, so this class is an introductory class because it doesn't presuppose any familiarity with Marx. So it's an attempt to kind of to introduce Marx from a philosophical vantage point, and in a way to render Marx's radical break with philosophy philosophically intelligible. Because the claim is that in order to understand Marx's critique of philosophy and why the peculiar radicalism of this critique, one requires certain philosophical resources. So the basic dialectical point is that one can't really understand in what sense Marx is breaking with philosophy unless one has certain philosophical resources to render that break intelligible. And the danger of not having a proper philosophical appreciation of the radicality of Marx's break with philosophy is that one thereby ends up re-philosophizing Marx's break. So the paradox is the following: is that people who insist that Marx's break with philosophy is absolute, and in a way, and who always resist any, who dogmatically resist any philosophical contextualization for Marx's break, end up re-philosophizing, inadvertently re-philosophizing it in that way. In a way that there's a disavowed, re-philosophization of Marx that occurs by not appreciating to the extent to which his break with philosophy comes from working through the radical advances that preceded his own theoretical engagement, and specifically the movement from Kant through Hegel and ultimately to Feuerbach. So our starting point for today's session is Feuerbach, because I think Feuerbach is in a way the missing link between Marx and Hegel. To understand, I think, Marx's kind of break with German idealism, or with Hegel in particular, one needs to understand Feuerbach and Feuerbach's critique of Hegel. So this is our first, this will be the topic of our first session. So today we're going to be looking at especially two books by Feuerbach, The Essence of Christianity, which is published in 1841, and Outline of a Philosophy of the Future from 1843. And the handout contains what I take to be the most really important passages from our point of view from these two works. Okay, another quick question. Does everyone have the syllabus? I sent a kind of a syllabus for the course with the readings and the kind of a rough breakdown of the topics for each of the 8 sessions. Does everyone have access to this?
Yeah, I don't think the people that weren't in email group wouldn't have them.
Okay. Well, if I mean, I can resend it right now. Okay, I'll resend it right now so that people can see it. Let me see. Okay, I'm going to resend the syllabus. Here it is. Okay, so I've just resent it. I'm not sure who's receiving, so I'm sending it to the organizer's email address, and I hope then someone can automatically forward it to the to everyone else. But basically, yes. Let me. I'll say a few other kind of I think necessary introductory clarifications. So yeah, this is a kind of an introduction to Marx. So I hope, I mean, anyone who knows Marx well, I'm afraid will be completely bored. Everything I'm going to say is going to be pretty obvious, and so if you know Marx and know Marx well, you may be kind of bored by the course. But I hope I hope that's not the case. Secondly, the reason I think what I hope the course achieves is Marx's legibility, theoretical legibility, right now is in many ways more difficult than it's ever been, because Marx is working in a kind of historical philosophical context, in a way which is in a way that the culmination of a kind of anthropocentrism, of philosophical anthropocentrism. And as I'm sure you're all aware, right now in contemporary critical theory, this is a position that is seen as the source of many kind of evils, and as something that is to be definitively rejected and abandoned. So in other words, in the wake of all these debates about post-humanism and anthrodecentrism, as it's sometimes called, the kind of the rejection of anthropocentrism and the rejection of all its attendant philosophical and political consequences, to understand exactly or in what sense Marx is anthropocentric is, I think, extremely important and valuable. So I think one of the things I suspect is that for a lot of people who aren't familiar with Feuerbach and Marx, many of the kind of the exaltation of human self-consciousness above every other phenomenon may seem peculiarly anachronistic. But one of the things I hope to kind of to demonstrate as this course proceeds is that it's not possible to dismiss this radical anthropocentric stance so easily and so quickly, and it's based and the question is whether in fact the kind of the post-humanism, or what is declared as post-human or anti-human in as an anti-human perspective in contemporary critical theory, may not be actually a kind of a regression, or in a way a kind of a disavowed humanism, which in a way perpetuates the prejudices that it claims to be discontinuing. Okay, so that's one of the things that I hope we can get a handle on as the course progresses. So, okay, the format will be, I'm going to try to, I'll try to go through the handout. I'll have a handout prepared for each session. I'll try to get through it, or as much of it as I can. And I hope that that takes no more than roughly about an hour. So then that we have at least another hour for discussion. Yeah, if any questions that arise, you know, if you could, you know, well, you can type them up and formulate them, and then I'll try to kind of to address them, you know, once I've gone through the handout. Alternatively, if you have a clarification, if something I say is unclear, or you know, or something on the handout is confusing, and you need a kind of an immediate response, just you know, just stop me. That's absolutely fine. So I don't mind being interrupted, you know, just to clarify something I'm saying. Okay, right. So now, if everyone is okay, then maybe I'll just get going. Yep. Matthew's asking, is there a way to access the handout if you don't have, does it, Matthew, do you have access to the handouts? Okay. Great, okay. Okay, so if everyone, if everyone is okay, if everyone is okay, then I'll get going. Okay, so the handout begins with an image from 1899 from the Mars, a German newspaper from 1899, which depicts Marx and the printing press chained by the censor and tortured by the Prussian eagle. So this is a depiction of Marx as Prometheus, and in a way, Marx's Prometheanism, or the you know, the Promethean ambitions of Marx's theoretical project are you know, famous, but also, you know, difficult to understand from the contemporary vantage point. There's a brief explanatory note about, you know, the what this cartoon is, you know, what this image is actually depicting. Marx had been the editor of the Rheinische Zeitung in, you know, 1840, 1843. Was continually harassed by the Prussian censors, and eventually resigned his editorship in 1843. And this is what this image is depicting. But I want to begin with Marx's famous declaration in his 1841 doctoral dissertation on the difference between the Democritean and Epicurean philosophy of nature. So this is Marx writing in his doctoral dissertation. This is the first passage on page 2 of the handout. Philosophy, as long as a drop of blood shall pulse in its world-subduing and absolutely free heart, will never grow tired of answering its adversaries with the cry of Epicurus. Not the man who denies the gods worshipped by the multitude, but he who affirms of the gods what the multitude believes about them is truly impious. Philosophy makes no secret of it. The confession of Prometheus, in simple words, I hate the pack of gods, is its own confession, its own aphorism against all heavenly and earthly gods who do not acknowledge human self-consciousness as the highest divinity. It will have none other besides. But to those poor March players who rejoice over the apparently worsened civil position of philosophy, it responds again as Prometheus replied to the servants of the god Hermes. Be sure of this. I would not change my state of evil fortune for your servitude. Better to be the servant of this rock than to be a faithful boy to Father Zeus. And Marx concludes, Prometheus is the most eminent saint and martyr in the philosophical calendar. Now, so this is 1841, and this is actually coincidental. This is the same year as the publication of Feuerbach's Essence of Christianity, which we will know. And the reason I want to examine this text is because I think this text explains Marx. Was reading Feuerbach, and Marx was so impressed by Feuerbach that he wrote him a letter. An admiring letter, I think in 1843, 44. Feuerbach, I think, provides the background for for understanding Marx's linking of philosophy and Prometheanism. So we'll now go through this the argument of Feuerbach's Essence of Christianity. And Feuerbach was a kind of a so-called left Hegelian. In other words, as I'm sure most of you know, Hegel died in 1831, I think, and in the aftermath of his death, his disciples split into roughly two factions: the so-called right and left Hegelians. Right Hegelians, in a way, kind of proclaimed, or adopted a kind of a conservative interpretation of Hegel's thought, which sanctified, or kind of was seen to be sanctifying, the Christian religion and the Prussian state, whereas left Hegelians thought that Hegel's philosophy, implicitly contained a radical critique of all established authorities, whether they be religious or political. So Feuerbach I'll begin by outlining, first of all, Feuerbach's focusing on the primacy of self-consciousness is clearly Hegelian, but he does so in a way which ultimately kind of leads him to a radical critique of Hegel, and this is, I hope to get to that by the end of this, of the handout. So first of all, for Feuerbach, conscious being, or Bewusstsein, is being conscious of species being. Okay, so this is the first proposition in the Essence of Christianity. Thematically, consciousness in the strictest sense, writes Feuerbach, is present only in a being to whom his species or his essential nature is an object of thought. The brute is indeed conscious of himself as an individual, and he has accordingly the feeling of self as the common center of successive sensations, but not as a species. Hence, he is without that consciousness which in its nature, as in its name, is akin to science. Where there is this higher consciousness, there is a capability of science. Science is the cognizance of species. In practical life, we have to do with individuals. In science, with species. But only a being to whom his own species, his own nature is an object of thought, can make the essential nature of other things or beings an object of thought. Okay, so a couple of things to say here is that, first of all, so this is Bewusstsein in German, or consciousness. There's a clear consciousness here is not simply what contemporary Anglophone philosophers called phenomenal consciousness, nor is it consciousness in the kind of post-Husserlian or phenomenological sense. Consciousness is here intimately linked with cognition. To be conscious is to know something, and for Feuerbach, what distinguishes human consciousness, or or rather what, not just human consciousness, but consciousness in the strict sense from any merely kind of sensory awareness, is that it is knowledge of universals or species. Science is indissociable from consciousness. You know, in a way, science is a kind of a manifestation of consciousness, in the sense that to be conscious is to know, but to know in the scientific sense, which entails knowing the essence or the genera of beings or entities. And moreover, this access to the being of entities is only possible because consciousness is, in a way, self-conscious. It's self-consciousness in the sense that to be conscious is to know one's own species being. Okay? To know, to recognize one's own generic or universal character. So this is why Feuerbach then links consciousness, self-consciousness, and science or cognition. The second point. Now, this the consciousness of infinity implies the infinity of consciousness, because consciousness, in a way, is relates. For Feuerbach being a Hegelian, consciousness relates to itself through another or through its object, but the way in which it relates to its object is by grasping the essential nature of this object, and this essential nature is only graspable through the medium of infinity, or what Feuerbach calls infinity. This is obscure for the time being, but I think it will become clear as we go on. So Feuerbach writes, this is quote number 2, consciousness in the strict or proper sense is identical with consciousness of the infinite. A limited consciousness is no consciousness. Consciousness is essentially infinite in nature. The consciousness of the infinite is nothing else than the consciousness of the infinity of consciousness. Or in the consciousness of the infinite, the conscious subject has for his object the infinity of his own nature. Okay. Now here, Feuerbach is just kind of reiterating Hegel's points about the essential infinity of self-consciousness. Why? Because consciousness is transcendence. It has this. It doesn't have a fixed or stable essence. Its essence consists in relating to what is not itself and recognizing itself in what is other to itself. So this is why it can't be simply delimited by what it is not. Consciousness has no contrary or opposite. And it's in this sense that it's infinite. It's unbounded by any kind of negation of its essential characteristics, because its essential characteristic is, in a way, to be what it is not, as Hegel puts it paradoxically. And this capacity, because consciousness is nothing but being what it is not and not being what it is essentially contradictory, and its contradictoriness allows it to overcome any finite characterization or determination of its essence. Okay, so this is it's in this sense then that consciousness is endowed with this power of transcendence. Okay, so this is point number 3. The absolutely transcendent object, for instance, God, is nothing but the subject's absolute transcendence, the transcendence of thinking, feeling, and willing. So this is Feuerbach Again, the absolute to man is his own nature. The power of the object over him is therefore the power of his own nature. Thus, the power of the object of feeling is the power of feeling itself. The power of the object of the intellect is the power of the intellect itself. And the power of the object of the will is the power of the will itself. Now here, obviously, thinking, feeling, and willing are the three traditional, characteristics of consciousness. There are three kind of, modalities of consciousness. And Feuerbach's claim is that whatever is acknowledged as absolute in any of these registers, whether it's an absolute power of thinking, an absolute power of feeling, or an absolute power of willing, is merely an externalization or a manifestation of the absolute power of thinking, feeling, or willing themselves. And this is, this is in a way is the crux of Feuerbach's whole kind of critique of theology and religion. What humans revere in worshipping a divinity are merely their own capacities or their own raised to the absolute power. So as he writes in quote number 4, it follows that if thou thinkest the infinite, thou perceivest and affirmest the infinitude of the power of thought. If thou feelest the infinite, thou feelest and affirmest the infinitude of the power of feeling. The object of the intellect is intellect objective to itself. The object of feeling is feeling objective to itself. And this is why subjective expression is or coincides with objective expression. And it's in this sense that for Feuerbach, consciousness is self-estrangement. So this is number 5. Whatever is a subjective expression of a nature is simultaneously also its objective expression. Man cannot get beyond his true nature. He may indeed, by means of the imagination, conceive individuals of another so-called higher kind, but he can never get loose from his species, his nature. Because remember, consciousness is nothing but consciousness of one's own species being for Feuerbach. So therefore the conditions of being, the positive final predicates which he gives to these other individuals, are always determinations or qualities drawn from his own nature. Qualities in which he in truth only images and projects himself. So this means that, as encapsulated in quote number 6, the object of any subject is nothing else than the subject's own nature taken objectively. So so the argument is very simple, is that all the characteristics, the transcendent characteristics attributed to God and to the God of Christianity in particular, or the divinity of the Abrahamic tradition is what Feuerbach has in mind here, are merely kind of are estranged absolutizations of capacities of thinking, feeling, or willing that are immanent to human consciousness. So this means, therefore, so what Feuerbach, in a way, so Feuerbach is a philosopher of radical immanence. He wants to kind of, bring God down to earth to show that what we worship and revere in divine transcendence is merely our own transcendent, the transcendent power of our own self-consciousness. This means that he wants to annul the division between the finite and the infinite or the human and the divine, or indeed between immanence and transcendence. In other words, he's reinscribing transcendence within immanence, within the immanence of human being and human existence. So this is quote number 7. So our task is to show that the antithesis of divine and human is altogether illusory, that it is nothing else than the antithesis between the human nature in general and the human individual, and that consequently, the objects and contents of the Christian religion are altogether human. Just to clarify this point here, it's nothing else than the antithesis between the human nature in general and the human individual, because in other words, what we project as the attributes of God are the attributes of our own generic humanity or species being. So in other words, that the individual reveres or worships the transcendent attributes of his or her own species being. And that's the estrangement. We're in religion, we are estranged from the transcendence of our own species being, and we reify it and hypostatize it as a kind of an alien being, because we fail to recognize the power, the transcendent power of our own generic species capacities, as elucidated through thinking, feeling, and willing. So then the quote continues. This is why, this is continuing number 7. The divine being is nothing else than the human being, or rather the human nature purified, freed from the limits of the individual man, and made objective, i.e. contemplated and revered as another, a distinct being. All the attributes of the divine nature are therefore attributes of human nature. Okay. Okay, I'm just checking. Okay, yes. Sorry, I'll continue. So therefore, the division between what something is for us and what is in itself is immanent to our consciousness of something. So here, again, this is simply kind of, so far back is simply kind of, in a way, emphasizing the way in which Hegel, overcomes the, Kant's transcendental kind of distinction between, immanence and transcendence, between the phenomenal and the noumenal, or what is in itself. As he writes in number 8, I cannot know whether God is something else in himself or for himself than he is for me. What he is to me all that he is. In the distinction stated above, the distinction between what God is for us and what he might be in himself, which is a kind of in a way that's the hiatus that separates the finite from the infinite in traditional theology. In this distinction, man takes a point of view above himself, above his nature, the absolute measure of his being. But this transcendentalism is only an illusion, for I can make the distinction between the object as it is in itself and the object as it is for me, only where an object can really appear otherwise to me, not where it appears to me such as the absolute measure of my nature determines it to appear, such as it must appear to me. It's true that I may have a merely subjective conception, i.e. one which does not arise out of the general constitution of my species, but if my conception is determined by the constitution of my species, the distinction between what an object is in itself and what it is for me ceases, for this conception is itself an absolute one. So in other words, what he's saying is that the gap between the relative and the absolute is merely the kind of the gap between the individual and its own species being. Okay, what is truly transcendent is species being, or the capacities of the species as such, and anything that appears to me, and the gap between appearance and reality, or between the relative and the absolute, is only measurable or intelligible, in terms of this discrepancy between, the universal and the particular. Okay, what must be apprehended at the level of the species is that which is in itself. What he thinks that is the only measure of absoluteness that is philosophically intelligible. And so this has the following consequence, number 9. This means that there's an inseparability of the subject and the predicate, or of being and the attribute, or of existence and essence. To relativize the essence or the attribute of an entity is also to relativize its existence or its being. This is number 9. If thou doubtest the objective truth of the predicate, thou must also doubt the objective truth of the subject whose predicates they are. If thy predicates are anthropomorphisms, the subject of them is an anthropomorphism too. I won't read the whole quote here. I'll just read the final 2 sentences. To know God and not oneself to be God, to know blessedness and not oneself to enjoy it, is a state of disunity, of unhappiness. Higher beings know nothing of this unhappiness. They have no conception of that which they are God. In other words, what he's saying is that the concept of God is nothing but the concept of the unity, the absolute equivalence of the subject and the predicate, or of essence and existence. That's what the concept of God is. God is that being whose essence entails its existence. Okay, and in traditional theology, there's a hiatus that we can never know God as God knows itself, because we are finite creatures and because we have finite cognitive capacities. But it's important that God, remember, God is both subject and object. God is not only an entity, God is also, God is everything and therefore knows everything as it is in itself. What Feuerbach is saying is that this, the gap between between finite and infinite cognition, the difference between knowing something from the outside or knowing something from a partial or limited perspective and knowing it absolutely or from the inside as it is in itself, is merely the gap between our individual or particular cognitive capacities and our generic or species cognitive capacity. In other words, to know God, it would simply be, to know ourselves in our, generic universality. So this is why ultimately kind of anthropology and theology fuse together for Feuerbach. This claim about the reversibility or the indissociability of subject and attribute, or the subject and the predicate, is also kind of, Hegelian, basically. This is simply kind of a reiteration of a Hegelian insight. There is no any attempt to separate the subject and the attribute absolutely, or to kind of insert some absolute gap between them, and to say that there is something, we know not what, that something exists which is entirely inaccessible or unknowable for us, is itself, it's a kind of alienation. It's a kind of cognitive alienation. Because the idea of a subject or a substratum whose attributes are definitively inaccessible to us is actually contradicts the very concept of what it is for something to be a subject or a substratum. In other words, there is no something that cannot be known. Okay? That if it's something, it must be characterizable and knowable. So what we really measure when we insist on this kind of hiatus between the relative and the absolute, once again, Feuerbach insists, we're merely kind of acknowledging the gap between our individuality and our genericity, our species being. So again, and this to reiterate the same point in 10, the necessity of the subject lies only in the necessity of the predicate. What the subject is lies only in the predicate. The predicate is the truth of the subject only the personified existing predicate, or the predicate conceived as existing. So now this has the following consequence. This is quotation number 11. Not the attribute of the divinity, but the divineness or deity of the attribute is the first true divine being. Thus, what theology and philosophy have held to be God, or the absolute or the infinite, is not God, but that which they have held not to be God is God, namely the attribute, the quality, or whatever has reality. And again, I'm just going to read the sections in bold because this is a very long quote. The fact is not that a quality is divine because God has it, but that God has it because it is in itself divine. Being without it, God would be a defective being. Only in the case in which I identify God and justice, in which I think of God immediately as the reality of the idea of justice, is the idea of God self-determined. But if God as a subject is the determined, while the quality or the predicate is the determining, then in truth, the rank of the Godhead is due not to the subject, but to the predicate. So in other words, that the absoluteness of the subject, or of the subject, i.e., the entity or that which is indissociable from its attributive characterization or its predicative characterization. So in other words, so everything that we revere as absolute is in fact attributable, is in fact a kind of an intelligible characteristic. And here, I mean, those of you who know Plato will immediately recognize here the argument, Socrates' rejoinder to Euthyphro. Is it right because God commands it, or does God command it because it is right? If anything that we absolutize, okay, must be, in absolutizing anything, we're also absolutizing its intelligible characteristics, or our characterization of it. Otherwise, otherwise we can't be properly absolutizing. If something is right merely because God commands it, and if its rightness derives from its being commanded, but there's nothing about the commandment itself which is intelligibly or intrinsically right, then we're relativizing. We're not absolutizing, but we're relativizing the very whatever property or characteristic we claim to be absolutizing. It's contradictory. So this is why, and because attributive characterization is in a way a function of consciousness's relationship to its object, it's the relationship between subject and object that is absolute, not the object in itself. This is what Feuerbach is saying here, and this is why, as he continues, in number 12, to enrich God, man must become poor, that God may be all, man must be nothing. What man withdraws from himself, what he renounces in himself, he only enjoys in an incomparably higher and fuller measure in God. In other words, whatever we deny ourselves, or anything, in a way, whatever we execrate in ourselves must somehow be elevated to the highest degree in God, because in a way the gesture of of elevation, in order for something to be elevated, something else must be denigrated, and Feuerbach is simply kind of emphasizing the indissociability of these two movements, the movement of ascent and descent. So, and the example, what he's saying here is that, for instance, what man withdraws from himself. So when man, for instance, when man renounces his own sensual nature, he's actually elevating it or absolutizing it in God. Or when we say that our own intelligence is corrupt and imperfect, we immediately kind of say that God's intelligence is perfect and absolute. Or as he continues, man denies as to himself only what he attributes to God. And thus, in reality, whatever religion consciously denies, always supposing that what is denied what is denied by it is something essential or true, and consequently incapable of being ultimately denied, it unconsciously restores in God. Whatever religion consciously denies, it unconsciously restores in God. So the key to understanding this dynamic is the movement of externalization and estrangement. Okay, and this is something. Again, this is Hegelian vocabulary that Feuerbach is taking over here. Now, I think this is really important, because I think this is to understand this is also to understand, this is absolutely kind of fundamental for Marx, and this is something I think Marx's whole account of alienation is basically taken from Feuerbach. Its ultimate source is Hegel, but it's Feuerbach's characterization of this movement of externalization and estrangement, which is really fundamental for Marx. So Feuerbach writes, man, and this is the mystery of religion, projects his being into objectivity. This is the movement of externalization, or Entäußerung, and then again makes himself an object to this projected image of himself, thus converted into a subject. He thinks of himself as an object to himself, but as the object of an object, of another being than himself. Now, it's important to emphasize the two moments here, the moment of externalization. So in a way, the first moment is the man projecting his being into objectivity. So man externalizes his own being, his cognitive capacities, or his sensuous or intentional capacities, into another object, but then absolutizes these capacities in this foreign object, and then subjects himself to this object. Okay. So in other words, the subject externalizes itself in an object, okay, but then absolutizes its own powers, absolutizes its own power of externalization in this object, so that this object becomes the true subject to which man is in turn subjected. He thinks of himself as an object to himself, but as the object of an object of another being than himself. So in other words, God is simply the kind of the externalization of human attributes, but then humanity makes itself the object of this divine object, thinking that it is a subject. And if you really, to understand this is to understand the way all of Marx is, even in, I think in Capital, this is really kind of the crux of Marx's entire account of, except Marx will change the terms of the analysis because it won't be consciousness, but it will be human practice, which is first, which is externalized and then estranged from itself in the real abstractions of capital, money, commodity, value, etc., etc. So number 15, thus the religious man virtually retracts the nothingness of human activity by making his dispositions and actions an object to God, by making man the end of God. For that which is an object to the mind is an end in action, and by making the divine activity a means of human salvation. Now, okay, this is this requires this is a different point that's being made here. Two things. One, Feuerbach is emphasizing the active nature of human human consciousness, the movement of externalization. Is an activity, it's an active capacity. And this is why he emphasizes thinking, feeling, and willing as active capacities. Now the point is that in religion, human activity is in the service of a transcendent end. Okay, the point of human existence is it serves a divine end. It serves a transcendent or extrinsic end. So this is what Feuerbach means when he says the religious man virtually retracts the nothingness of human activity, the fact that all human activity is effectively worthless unless it's devoted to God, unless our actions are oriented towards God, they're rendered null and void. So in other words, we evaluate the worth of our activity by considering it from God's vantage point. In other words, we turn our dispositions and actions into objects for God. In other words, man himself becomes an end by making man the end of God. In other words, we act in acting for God, in orienting our activity towards God. We have to objectify our actions for God. We have to consider our actions as they would be judged by God. But in doing this, we revert the relationship of priority, and we make our own activity God's purpose. Okay, the relationship of means and ends is inverted. It turns out that whatever is excellent or virtuous in human activity can only be judged as from God's vantage point, from this transcendent vantage point. But in doing so, we make this human activity becomes an end in itself for God. This is what Feuerbach means when he says that which is an object to the mind is an end in action. So it's God's judgment of our activities, which is an object to the mind, but this is the end of our action. This is the ultimate purpose of all our activity. And this, once our actions, if our actions are judged or divinely judged as virtuous, then they are redeemed. But But this redemption is really, man redeeming himself through a God or a divinity, which is simply the self-externalization of man's own absolute judgment of the worth of his own activities. So this is why Feuerbach writes, God acts that man may be good and happy. So in other words, we think that God is the end, everything we do is for God, but in fact, everything that God does is for man. God acts that man may be good and happy. Thus man, while he's apparently humiliated to the lowest degree, is in truth exalted to the highest. In and through God, man has in view himself alone. It is true that man places the aim of his action in God, but God has no other aim of action than the moral and eternal salvation of man. Thus man has in fact no other aim than himself. The divine activity is not distinct from the human. So in other words, the divine activity, which is creation of the universe, an estranged form of human activity, which is either the true telos of human activity, is in fact the creation of the world. And what we revere in God is in fact our own transcendent power to make the world. So in other words, so this divine activity is in a way simply kind of the estranged form of generic human activity. So finally, Feuerbach, so this is number 16. I'm just going to read the section in bold here. This means Feuerbach writes that the necessary turning point of history is therefore the open confession that the consciousness of God is nothing else than the consciousness of the species, that man can and should raise himself only above the limits of his individuality and not above the laws, the positive essential conditions of his species, that there is no other essence which man can think, dream of, imagine, feel, believe in, wish for, love, and adore as the absolute than the essence of human nature itself. So now this is important. I mean, obviously, Feuerbach here thinks that he thinks in a way that Hegelian speculative philosophy has provided us with the cognitive resources to bring God down to earth, to realize that everything that we revered in God is nothing but ourselves, is nothing but our own power, our own generic capacities. And therefore the turning point of history is the realization, is in a way the kind of the de-alienation, the realization that what we worship in God, understood as absolute transcendence, infinite power, infinite creativity, etc., is nothing but our own infinite power. And finally, this is the final quotation from Essence of Christianity is 17. Feuerbach writes, thus the work of self-conscious reason in relation to religion is simply to destroy an illusion. But an illusion which is by no means indifferent, but which on the contrary is profoundly injurious in its effects on mankind, which deprives man as well of the power of real life as of the genuine sense of truth and virtue. And ultimately, we need only, as we have shown, invert the religious relations, regard that as an end which religion supposes to be a means, exalt that into the primary, which in religion is subordinate, the accessory into the condition. At once we have destroyed the illusion and the unclouded light of truth streams in upon us. The absolute, the means that we posited as relative to an absolute end are in fact the absolute end in itself. This is Feuerbach's conclusion, but he thinks that this understanding this will entail is a revolutionary transformation at least at the level of cognitive consciousness. And in a way, what Marx wants to do, he thinks, is in a way to kind of to go beyond Feuerbach by showing how, even Feuerbach himself has not gone far, but Feuerbach has, in a way, kind of contained this radical revolutionary rupture within, the medium of cognitive consciousness, whereas, or consciousness, whereas Marx thinks it should be generalized to, to human being as such, understood as practical activity or practice. But this will become clear next week when we look at Marx's critique of Feuerbach. Now, just before, so there's just 2 more pages to go on the handout, 2.5 pages. So now we move, this is in a way the coda to this discussion. It's provided by Feuerbach's Principles of the Philosophy of the Future, published 2 years later in 1843. Now, speculative transcendence then, on Feuerbach's account, is rendered imminent as the fusion of the sensuous and the supersensuous, or the phenomenal and the noumenal. Feuerbach writes at the opening of Principles of the Philosophy of the Future, the task of the modern era was the realization and humanization of God, the transformation and dissolution of theology into anthropology. The rational or theoretical assimilation and dissolution of the God who is otherworldly to religion, and hence not given to it as an object, is the speculative philosophy. So in other words, for Feuerbach, this speculative philosophy has not been, fully consummated so long as it, fails to consummate the rendering imminent of transcendence, or the fusion of these 2 domains which metaphysical philosophy had separated. And what he wants, there's 2 aspects to this. One is that the first aspect is cognitive. It's that the absolute knowledge or divine knowledge is attainable for human beings. Human beings can know everything, but not as Hegel thought, simply through the medium of philosophy. And this is what the first aspect of Feuerbach's critique of Hegel, distance from Hegel. For Hegel, absolute knowledge is conceptual and unfolds in the medium of the concept. Whereas for Feuerbach, absolute knowledge unfolds in the medium of sensuous existence. And to understand this, we have to understand his critique of Hegel, which I'll come to in a minute. But first of all, in number 20, Feuerbach, in a way, explains why he thinks once we realize, once we make this, once we carry out this revolutionary transformation in consciousness, we realize that absolute knowledge or divine knowledge is humanly attainable. So in number 20, he writes, theism, however, attributes to God not only speculative but also sensuous and empirical knowledge understood in its highest perfection. Because remember, the gap between relative and absolute, or between the intelligible and the sensible, is nullified for God. So God not only kind of understands the generic or intelligible characteristics of entities, but also their sensuous particular characteristics. Because God understands or knows everything as it is in itself, which means that he has knowledge of the sensuous and the empirical, and not just of the supersensuous and the transcendent. And Feuerbach continues, just as God's pre-wordly and object antecedent knowledge has found its realization, truth, and reality in the a priori knowledge of speculative philosophy, by which he means Hegelian philosophy, so too has the sensuous knowledge of God found its realization, truth, and reality in the empirical sciences of the modern era. The most perfect and hence divine sensuous knowledge is therefore nothing but the most sensuous of all knowledge, the knowledge of the tiniest minutiae and of the most inconspicuous details. God is omniscient, says Aquinas, because he knows even the most particular things. The knowledge that does not just indiscriminately put the hair on the human head together into a tuft, but counts and knows each one of its hair for hair. But this divine knowledge, which is only a matter of imagination and fantasy in theology, becomes the rational and real knowledge of the natural sciences produced through the telescope and the microscope. Natural science has counted the stars in the sky, the ova and the spawn of fish and butterflies, and the dots on the wings of the insects in order to distinguish one from the other. So in other words, what he's saying is that the gap between both what is most universal and generic and what is most unique and particular must be brought together. And this is what knowledge, so knowledge is both a priori and a posteriori. It's both transcendental and empirical, and both, and in a way, the kind of the consequence of this de-estrangement, recognizing our own infinite cognitive capacities, is to realize that we can to begin to undertake the task, the realization of absolute knowing, which will be both empirical and transcendental. This knowledge, and what it seems now, of course, he's saying, now this is, the obvious retort here is to say that this is like another kind of theological fantasy, to which Feuerbach responds that precisely because he's anthropologized theology, he's saying that everything that we thought was divinely transcendent is in fact humanly transcendent at the level of the species. Because as he puts it in number 21, man's idea of God is the idea of the human individual of his own species. God is the totality of all the realities and perfections, is nothing other than the totality of the qualities of the species compendiously put together in him for the benefit of the limited individual, but actually dispersed among men and realizing themselves in the course of world history. So in other words, what is transcendent at the individual level, it will be immanent at the species level. So this, once again, the gap between the empirical and the transcendental only pertains at the alienated individual level, at the level of alienated individual consciousness, but at the level of collective or generic human consciousness, these two aspects are brought together as a collective accomplishment of something that must be collectively realized by the species. And in number 22, he writes, the divine knowledge that knows each particular thing simultaneously has its reality in the knowledge of the species. Okay, I'm just checking the time here. Okay, it's 6:14. Right, so now I'm just going to briefly, I'll conclude by outlining Feuerbach's critique of Hegel. And this critique of Hegel entails a kind of an elevation of sensuous reality. which is also decisive for Marx. But the meaning that sensuousness has in this Feuerbachian and then subsequently Marxist register is precisely not empirical. So what Feuerbach articulates is a non-empirical understanding of sensuous reality. To understand this, we have to understand his critique of Hegel. So this is number 23. Feuerbach writes, the identity of thinking and being, which is a central point in the philosophy of identity, by which he means Hegel here, is nothing other than a necessary consequence, an unfolding of the concept of God as the being whose concept or essence contains its existence. Okay, that's the first point. So that, infamously in Hegel, the absolute concept is that which truly is or truly exists. The gap between essence and existence is, transcended in the absolute concept. This is Hegel's absolute idealism. But now I'll read the second sentence in bold here on page 7. But a being that is not distinguished from thought, that is, a being that is only a predicate or a determination of reason, or only a conceived, an abstract being, is in truth no being at all. The identity of thinking and being expresses, therefore, only the identity of thought with itself. This means that absolute thought is unable to cleave itself from itself, that it cannot step out of itself to be able to reach being. Being remains something of the beyond. Absolute philosophy has to be sure, turn the world of philosophy, turn the world of theology into the world of the here and now for us. But for that matter, it has turned the this-sidedness of the real world into an over beyond. The thought of speculative or absolute philosophy determines being distinct from itself as the activity of mediation, as that which is immediate, as that which is unmediated. For thought, at least for the thought which we are discussing, being is nothing more than this. Thought posits being as counterposed to itself, but still within itself. It thereby immediately and without difficulty eliminates the opposition between being and itself. For being, as the antithesis of thought within thought, is nothing itself but thought. But if being is nothing more than that which is unmediated, if unmediatedness alone constitutes its distinction from thought, how easy it is then to demonstrate that the determination of unmediatedness, namely being, belongs to thought as well. If the essence of being is constituted by what is merely a determination of thought, how should being be distinguished from thought? So Feuerbach claims simply that Hegel's internalization of being to thought, or his claim that thinking and being are one and indivisible, in a way presupposes, does not take the, in other words, does not take the kind of, the difference between being and thinking seriously enough. But the problem is this, the problem is, how does one specify this difference or this distinction in being and thought without, in a way, given Feuerbach's own critique of any attempt to kind of absolutely segregate substance and attribute, or the subject from the predicate. In other words, how can we possibly make sense of the reality of a being in its irreducibility to thought in a way without kind of, without absolutizing some conceptual determination, without absolutizing, in a way, thought's own relationship to this allegedly transcendent being. This is the problem. So Feuerbach's, the ensuing movement of Feuerbach's critique is very interesting. So now we go to number 24. What he thinks actually that yes, sorry.
We might. Hello.
Sure.
Yeah.
Hello. Yeah. Do you want to have a 5-minute break?
Because we're half of the time.
Okay. Sure. Yep. So shall we say? I mean, okay. So by my watch, it's 20 minutes past 6.
Yeah.
So shall we start back in 25 minutes past?
Okay.
Okay. Does that sound okay?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay. Then I'll leave the speaker on. So just give me a shout whenever everyone's ready to continue.
Okay.
Okay. Thanks. Hi.
Hello.
Hi. Hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Okay, shall I continue?
Yes.
Okay, great. So just to conclude, so this is this is quotation number 24, and really the penultimate quote on the handout. So this is now really the crux of Feuerbach's critique of Hegel. So he writes, if the reality of thought is reality as thought, it is itself only thought, and we are forever imprisoned in the identity of thought with itself, an idealism that differs from subjective idealism only insofar as it encompasses the whole of reality, subsuming it under the predicates of thought. Hence, should the reality of thought be a matter of real seriousness to us, something other than thought must accrue to it. It must, as realized thought, be other than what it is as unrealized or pure thought, the object not only of thought, but also of non-thought. That thought realizes itself means simply that it negates itself, ceases to be mere thought. Now, what is this non-thought, this something different from thought? It is the sensuous. That thought realizes itself means accordingly that it makes itself the object of the senses. Thus, the reality of the idea is sensuousness, but reality is also the truth of the idea, and hence sensuousness is the truth of the idea. But in this way, we have at the same time made sensuousness the predicate and the idea or thought the subject. The only question is, why does the idea take on sensuousness? Why does it cease to be true when it is not real or sensuous? Is not its truth thus made dependent on sensuousness? Are not significance and value thus being conceded to the sensuous as such, that is, apart from its being the reality of the idea? If taken by itself, sensuousness is nothing, why is it needed by the idea? And if value and content are bestowed upon sensuousness by the idea, sensuousness is pure luxury and trumpery, only an illusion which thought practices upon itself. But it is not so. The demand that the idea realize itself, that it assumes sensuousness, arises from the fact that sensuous reality is unconsciously held to be the truth, which is both prior to and independent of thought. Thought proves its truth by taking recourse to sensuousness. How could this be possible if sensuousness was not unconsciously held to be the truth? But since one consciously proceeds from the truth of thought, the truth of sensuousness is acknowledged only in retrospect, whereby sensuousness is reduced merely to an attribute of the idea. But this is a contradiction, for sensuousness is an attribute, and yet it lends truth to thought. That is, it is both essential and inessential, both substance and accident. The only way out of this contradiction is to regard sensuous reality as its own subject, to give it an absolutely independent, divine, and primary significance, and not one derived from the idea. And ultimately, Feuerbach concludes, taken in its reality or regarded as real, the real is the object of the senses, the sensuous. Truth, reality, and sensuousness are one and the same thing. Only a sensuous being is a true and real being. Only through the senses is an object given in the true sense and not through thought for itself. The object given by and identical with ideation is merely thought. So I think, now this is, so what Feuerbach's argument here is simply this, is that the immediacy for Hegel, thought or conceptualization is mediation, and whatever is the opposite, or whatever is juxtaposed as thought's other, therefore, can only be thought of as immediacy. So being would be immediacy, but as Hegel famously points out in the opening of the Logic, pure or absolute immediacy is nothing at all. Being as absolute immediacy is indiscernible from nothing. So being and nothing are always vanishing into one another. It's a kind of a pure abstraction. And this is the starting point of Hegel's kind of, logic, and of Hegel's whole kind of dialectical, the dialectical movement, which will internalize thought, or will internalize being to thought, or render being entirely transparent or coextensive with thought. Okay, and that this is what Feuerbach is trying to reject. So Feuerbach is saying that there is more to being than it's simply being, than it's being the kind of the merely abstract negation of thought, or there's more to being than abstract immediacy. And this is the reason why this move is necessary, because it's, if being and thoughts are in a way kind of intrinsically are interdependent, we must also, we must think being, but we must also acknowledge the being of thought, or the reality of thought. And what Feuerbach is suggesting is that if we take the reality of thinking seriously, in other words, if we don't simply conceive of thinking in a psychologistic register, which is obviously what the whole idealist tradition wants to do, it wants to say that thinking is not just psychological activity. Thinking can't be confined to the the limits of what's going on in the kind of the craniums of a certain kind of species of animal. Then we must acknowledge its reality. But its reality demands to be conceived, or demands to be ratified independently of thinking conceived as mediation. So this is why he writes in 24, the reality of thought is reality as thought. In other words, if thought's only reality is its reality as, as conceptualized, as transparent as thought, then this is still, Feuerbach is saying that this is still an abstract conception of thought. We're still not, we're still idealizing thought, and not, in a way, kind of successfully or definitively de-psychologizing it. In other words, we're not freeing the reality of thought from the set of predicates that are merely coextensive with thinking as currently conceived. So he continues, the reality of thought, if we take the reality of thought seriously, thinking, this reality must be something other than, must be something other than thought, but other than thought in a way which goes beyond the opposition between mediation and immediacy. It can't simply be other to thought as pure immediacy. And as he puts it, and this is again in 24, it must be realized thought. It must be realized. And the difference between realized thought and unrealized thought is the difference between thinking that is merely conceptually effectuated, or thinking whose realization is still confined to the medium of the conceptual, and thinking that is realized beyond the conceptual. And for Feuerbach, this means in sensuous reality. Okay, what is unthought, okay, or in a way, what is the kind of the antithesis, the non-conceptual juxtaposition to thought in this sense is sensuality or sensuousness. Not sensuality, but sensuous existence. So in other words, so this is why, you know, he says the demanded idea, and in a way he says that Hegel must acknowledge this, because Hegel himself says that, so sensuousness means spatial temporal existence. So here, what Feuerbach is doing in a way is rehabilitating Kant's distinction between, you know, concepts and intuitions, or between the conceptual sphere and the spatial temporal domain as non-conceptual. But he's saying that there is, you know, non-conceptual reality is sensuous reality, but this sensuous reality is the medium for the realization of thought. It's the only guarantee for the reality of thought that would not, you know, surreptitiously re-idealize thought, or surreptitiously, in a way, you know, nullify the reality of thought or the being of thought. And hence the result is a conception of the sensuous, which is not empirical, okay? In a way, which, I mean, although Feuerbach doesn't use the term transcendental, it's, I mean, he could use, the sensuous in this regard is not simply that which is, you know, kind of, you know, the object of perception, or the, that which is kind of, you know, empirically accessible to us. It's the medium in which conceptualization is realized, and it's not simply apparent to, it's not simply apparent for conceptual consciousness. Okay, I'm going to stop here because I've gone on. This has already gone on too long. But this is the crux of, or I take this to be the crux of Feuerbach's critique of Hegel. He wants to rehabilitate the autonomy, so to speak, or the independence of sensuous reality, as a way of, but in a speculative register. Okay, in a register which isn't empirical, or which isn't empiricist. So when he's talking about sensuous being or sensuous reality, he's not talking about you know, things which we can sense, or what is accessible to the senses, nor is he simply talking about sensuousness as kind of as a form of intuition, as a manifold of intuition. What he's saying, I think, is sensuousness as something that is realized through human practical activity, and this is absolutely decisive for Marx. I think that Marx's conception of practical materialism, the claim that materialism is about the primacy of praxis, it hinges upon this Feuerbachian conception of sensuousness, in opposition to the merely conceptual. Okay, that's all I wanted to kind of to say. So I'll just stop here, and we should have a discussion. Okay, so let's. I mean, I'm happy to, you know, answer, you know, any questions that anyone may have.
I mean, I'm kind of curious. Oh, I'm echoing. I don't want to keep talking.
Yep. Hello.
If you put headphones in, it should work out. Or if you don't have headphones, just mute yourself for the moment.
Okay, I'll try to find some. I think maybe if you mute the question, then.
Or you could just type the question in the sidebar.
I think it would be better if Ray mute himself during the question.
Okay, so Rachel has just asked, why does Feuerbach emphasize thinking, feeling, and willing, if it is to be sensuous reality, as it explains this? Okay, good question. Well, in a way, what he's saying, if these are conceived as activities, what he's saying is that precisely insofar as they are active, they are sensuously realized. In other words, that their active nature is sensuous. So in a way, what he's saying is that thinking, feeling, and willing are as the kind of, the fundamental kind of powers of human consciousness are sensuously realized. And in a way so that thinking is not something that goes on. They're not, to think, to feel, and to will is to act in sensuous reality. In other words, they are concretely or sensuously realized. And that is their reality or their being. In a way, so the sensuous is the medium of actuality, I think, for Feuerbach. So this is why he's saying that thinking is not something, obviously, consciousness in this sense encompasses more than, it encompasses all facets of human being and of human activity, which is why human beings are sensuous beings, and in a way, and the reality of their consciousness is sensuously ratified. It's because thinking, feeling, and willing manifest themselves in sensuous spatial temporal reality that they are real. So I think that's what he's saying.
Hey, Rachel, can you speak? Hey.
If Rochelle's not asking her question, I'll ask one. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
So, I'm curious to hear more about this elision between the Kantian manifold of intuition and human practice. So it's like, I guess my question is, so for Feuerbach as opposed to for Kant, like this notion of the sensible, like it's like it's still something that's still posited by consciousness, kind of, or something that can be transformed to a more radical degree than it could be for Kant, or like I'm kind of curious how it sort of how this really escapes Hegel without while kind of retaining the dynamism, I guess, of the dialectic.
Okay, it's another very important question. Okay, yes. So this is Now, it's clearly, so I think, as I understand him, Feuerbach must insist that sensuous reality is precisely not simply kind of, it's certainly not posited by consciousness. And in a way, he's going to insist, and he can't be Kantian, it can't simply be a form of intuition. In other words, because remember, for Kant, sensibility is a faculty, is a kind of a faculty of the subject, through which we are affected by, what is the thing in itself, basically. So Feuerbach wants to desubjectivize the sensuous, but then he has to do, it's a tricky maneuver, he has to do it without being, he can't simply be a kind of, what sensuousness is, can't be confined to the level of sensation, so to speak. So what the reality of the sensuous is not merely coextensive with, our sensory modalities. And I think, and I think this is the limits of his critique, because in a way he has a problem here in that, in order, the more he tries to say about, in what sense sensuousness is both, irreducible to the concept, to mere conceptual determination, but also not simply, coextensive with that which is, subjectively or empirically apprehended. In other words, he wants to insist that it's not conceptual, but it's not empirical either. In a way, the more determinations he attributes to it, I think the more he risks opening, the Hegelian rejoinder will come immediately. And in a way, I guess what he's trying to say is, it's a very intriguing argument. He wants to say that in a way, I think that what he's saying is that because thinking is, an activity, and because in a way it's always about, it's a transitive activity that is always kind of object oriented in this kind of Hegelian sense. It's about something. There's always a kind of an object of consciousness. This in a way, the fact, I think he's saying or suggesting that this transcendence of self-consciousness, its exteriorization, must unfold, implies a medium which is itself non-conceptual. So, and I think that the distinction here is between consciousness and conceptualization. So remember, Feuerbach talks about consciousness, but he doesn't take consciousness to be conceptual consciousness. So when he talks about thinking, feeling, and willing, for him these are not modes of conceptualization. So I think what he's saying is that consciousness is sensuous. So in a way, so I think the maneuver will be to say that sensuousness is the medium of consciousness, and it's the medium in which thinking, feeling, and willing unfold, and therefore conceptualization, which is the kind of the mode of activity kind of commensurate with thinking, with the cognitive aspect of consciousness, is simply, must always be kind of sensuously enveloped, so that whatever reality thinking has or conceptualization has, it must kind of unfold in the domain of the sensuous, which he thinks is this is, the world, this spatial temporal reality. But in a way, I think he doesn't, in a way, he thinks that any characterization, any conceptual characterization of the sensuous immediately fragments it and reincorporates it into the dimension of thinking. So in a way, that this is what he wants to say, that there is more to sensuous reality that can be explicitly conceptualized at any phase of our cognitive evolution. I think that's what he wants to say.
How far does he go in attempting to establish a determinate concept of the sensuous?
Sorry. So this is in this is in the Principles for a Philosophy of the Future. As far as I know, I'm not, as far as I know, he doesn't go much further. I mean, he goes on, he carries on a few pages. This is towards the end of the book, but no, he doesn't go. There's no further kind of characterization of the sensuous. So in a way, what I'm saying, I'm trying to reconstruct what his response would be to kind of these Hegelian rejoinders. But no, he doesn't say anything else about it. He just talks about the sensuous, and I think it's unfortunate that he doesn't kind of go further, because it's clear that he has to say two things. One is that what sensuous reality can't be, of course, it can be conceptually characterized, but that doesn't mean that that doesn't imply that this conceptual characterization can exhaust its actuality or its reality. In other words, he will say that whatever reality the conceptual characterization of the sensuous has depends on the transcendence of the sensuous vis-a-vis this conceptual characterization. And in a way, this is why he's going to tie it to consciousness. He's going to say, because for consciousness for Feuerbach is activity, is this process of exteriorization. And I think that, in a way that sensuousness is, unlike, for Hegel, spirit externalizes itself in space and time, but space and time are exhaustively kind of conceptualizable. There's no non-conceptual residue to spatial temporal reality, whereas for Feuerbach, the reality of the sensuous always exceeds any determinate conceptual characterization. He's not saying it's unconceptualizable, but he's saying it's the medium of conceptualization as such. And here, this is a move that lots of these German philosophers are making at the time. They're saying there's something, it's what Schelling sometimes calls the unprethinkable. I mean, I think there's a connection here. It's that which is always already in effect before you can think, or do anything. But he doesn't, I'm not an expert on Feuerbach, but he certainly in that book, neither in The Essence of Christianity nor in Principles for a Philosophy of the Future does he go further with this kind of notion of the sensuous. Okay, there's is that kind of satisfactory or for the time being?
Yeah, it is. Thank you.
Okay, so now there's a question from Matthew. So I'll read the question. I'm curious about the relationship between Feuerbach and Hegel. Because of empirical contradictions between political and religious thinking / life, Hegel argues that the history of progress is self-realization, a term Feuerbach picks up on. But doesn't this contradict the lack of freedom in political and religious life? By this, okay, do you mean if the history of progress is self-realization, how is this compatible with the lack of freedom in political and religious life? Well, this is a, this is a complicated question. I mean, okay, so on one hand, Hegel's critics say that that his claim that, the real is rational, the rational is real, saying that, all the freedom that we want or need is available, is realized in and through the institutions of, bourgeois civil society and, or the Prussian state. Okay, so that the individual freedom is, in a way realized in and through the state. For Hegel, I mean, it's a simplification, but I guess that's the basic gist of it. So Hegel would say any other conception of freedom is a mere abstraction. Now, of course, I mean, things here get, Hegel can be read as a conservative or as a radical. So either he'll say that kind of freedom can only be realized in and through civil society and the state, or it's possible that this kind of the realization of freedom demands, the transformation of these institutions. To be honest, like I think that's ambiguous in Hegel himself, and Marx certainly reads Hegel as being, conservative and kind of, providing a kind of an alibi for reaction. But Marx then doesn't think that the problem can't simply be the deficiencies in Hegel's accounts can't simply be developed by focusing on freedom considered in abstraction, I think. So I'm not really answering the question. I mean, it's a very complicated question that I can't answer very properly. I'll read. I mean, the follow-up is Matthew's follow-up is Marx's critique of Hegel's dialectic as too mysterious. The demystification which dialectic suffers, the mystification which dialectic suffers in Hegel's hand, by no means prevents him from being the first to present a general form of working in a conscious and comprehensive manner. Can you comment on this? Well, yeah, I mean, so Marx famously, although he rejects what he takes to be Hegel's idealism, but thinks that Hegelian dialectics is this, conceptual treasure trove, or this is this kind of has potentially revolutionary implications. And there's a lot later on in the course, actually, when we look at Althusser, we'll see Althusser's whole kind of critique of Hegelian Marxism is the claim that when Marx talks about, in the Introduction to Capital, when Marx talks about the kind of, the rational kernel and the mystical shell, the claim that the dialectic is the rational kernel that is enveloped in the mystical shell of Hegel's absolute idealism, and that historical materialism merely kind of turns the dialectic the right way up. Well, there's a lot to say about how this metaphor of inversion and envelopment is to be understood. In other words, the mystification for the young Marx, or for the early Marx, the Hegelian mystification is to attribute a moving force to concepts or to ideas. The claim that history, or that the absolute concept, is the moving force in human history, and that all human kind of social formations are manifestations of this of spirits, which is rational self-consciousness, which is itself which has a conceptual structure, which is ultimately conceptually intelligible. So for Marx, the mystification is to believe that these, that either consciousness or concepts are the ultimately determining factors in social reality. But then so he wants to emphasize human practical activity and say that consciousness, conceptualization are themselves determined by human practical activity, and that consciousness is merely the the understanding of the world in consciousness is merely the inverted image of what is actually going on in in material reality, in reality as practically determined. So that's what he means. But this, as we'll see later on, it becomes much more complicated by the time Marx is writing the first volume of Capital, and here, because in Capital, then so famously in letters to Engels, he's saying that rereading that his method for writing Capital is inspired by Hegel's greater logic, and we'll see that scholars have puzzled over in what way Hegel's logic could have provided the methodological paradigm for Marx's Capital, and it's quite complicated and not at all obvious. But in a way, Marx remains a dialectical thinker. So he believes that dialectics is not necessarily tied to idealism, and he thinks so. But he never, Marx himself never uses the term dialectical materialism. But in a way, there's a materialist dialectics in Marx. But what materiality for Marx means practice, means sensuous practical activity. So the first step in Marx's materialist critique of Hegel is provided by Feuerbach's notion of the sensuous, the primacy of the sensuous over the merely intelligible. But there's a problem here. I think it's not clear. Certainly, now Feuerbach doesn't think that sensuousness is dialectically articulated. So then the problem is what does it mean if to be materialist is to affirm the primacy of the sensuous in this Feuerbachian sense over the merely conceptual? Then where does dialectics fit? Because famously, Hegelian dialectics is all about conceptual determination. It's all about determinate negation, and it's all about the negation of conceptual determinations by further conceptual determination. So in a way, the labor of the negative for Hegel is internal to the concept, whereas in Marx, there's it seems that these dialectical dynamics or these dialectical determinations unfold outside the concept in the domain of the sensuous, but that's a very peculiar thing to say. In other words, it's not clear how one can be a materialist, at this stage, it's not at all clear how one can affirm the irreducibility of the sensuous to the conceptual and maintain the methodological primacy of dialectics. In other words, if reality is irreducible to the concept, and if its sensuousness is non-conceptual, then how is it dialectically intelligible? Can dialectics simply be transplanted from the conceptual domain to the sensual domain? That's a real problem, I think. I think Marx has an answer, but it's a complicated answer.
Hi. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I'm on my phone app right now, and so I've got a problem. I can't see if there's a queue, and if there is, I'd like to get it. I just can't see the texts. Should I just ask the question?
Yeah, you can just ask the question.
Okay, cool. So at the beginning, actually, I have two questions. I'll just go with the first one though for now. And when you began, you said that without having a proper philosophical understanding of the foundations of Marxist thought, people often inadvertently re-philosophize Marx. And I'm just curious to hear what are some examples of how this plays out in the scholarship?
Hey Ray, can you unmute yourself? I'm trying to unmute yourself.
Hello? Hello, can you hear me?
Hello?
Yep. Okay. So in response to this question, so for instance, the question of material, in what sense is Marx a materialist? And if materialism is to be understood, if the materiality is linked to this Feuerbachian notion of the sensuous, which we've just discussed, well, clearly, in order to understand, this is a notion of the sensuous, which is it's not empirical, and in order to, it's a very kind of peculiar kind of conception. So in order to understand in what sense Marx is a materialist, and the contrast between contemplative or philosophical materialism, which he's criticizing, and what he calls practical materialism, we have to understand the link between practice and sensuality, because sensuous reality is the medium of practical activity. But then it seems that without an understanding of Feuerbach, what Marx means by sensuous becomes completely confusing. And you come across some readings of Marx but they think that it's you can easily think, well, it's obvious what sensuous means. It just means what we can see, feel, and touch with our senses. But I don't think that that's what Marx means by the sensuous. And as I'll suggest, I think that precisely kind of by the time he writes, Capital, the domain of the sensuous is actually imperceptible, where it's the domain of consciousness, which is perceptible, and the domain of the sensuous, which is imperceptible. Okay, because the whole point about materiality in Marx's sense is that you can't point to it. Okay, you can't point to a mode of production. You can't point to the value form or to the exchange abstraction. But these are the material determinants of social reality as uncovered by his theory. So
Can I say something?
Yes.
Talking about Marx, it is something that he claimed also in his early manuscripts. Talking about the sensual nature of human materiality.
Mm-hmm.
When he said that human feel in a collective way. That means that the way people feel, touch, and experience the world is determined by their social being. So in his early manuscripts, he already has the idea that sensuousness is not only an individual thing, but is something that is mediated through interaction with other people and the context in which other people operate. Can you mute yourself?
Yes. yes, but then to understand, to understand this kind of this social dimension, the social dimension of human being, of human experience is, again, sociality in Marx's sense, I think, is not. It's tied to conditions of production, conditions of production and reproduction, which he's trying to elaborate, and once again, it's production is sensuous, unfolds in the domain of sensuous reality. It's precisely, it transcends the facets of sensuous reality which are individually accessible. So the reality of social production, is sensuous, but that very kind of dimension of sensuousness, is not individually perceptible. You don't access it or experience it at the individual level. So I think, so I agree with what you just said, but I mean, in a way, in Feuerbach, in a way, I suggested that sensuousness, the domain of sensuousness, is the element of consciousness. It's the medium of thinking, willing, and feeling. But I think that what Marx wants to do, or his kind of critique of Feuerbach, is to say that, in fact, sensuousness is not the medium of consciousness, but of practice, of practical activity, most of which is in a way unconscious for us, because it's not, because we often don't know what it is we are thinking, what it is we are doing when we think, feel, and will. And in a way, so I think that there's a kind of a diremption between the sensuous reality of practical productive activity and our conscious apprehension of that activity, which I think is for him necessarily distorted by ideology. So, in other words, there's an appearance reality distinction in Marx, a really radical appearance reality distinction. And I think it's the distinction between the reality of practice, the sensuous reality of practice, and in a way the kind of, the ideological representation of that practice, or a subsequent apprehension, conceptual apprehension of that practice. I don't know if that kind of answers your question. Any other questions?
I'll go again.
Sure.
So I did not get a copy of the syllabus, and I understand that it's being shared, or that we will get our hands on it. But I was curious if you could spend a little bit of time just talking about its structure and your kind of rationale for the readings that you've brought in. I know you mentioned that there is, for instance, Althusser. I'm just curious about who else is on there and kind of what your approach was to setting up the syllabus. And I muted you, so you'll have to unmute it.
Yeah, sure. Okay, let me see if I can get the syllabus up here. is there any way in which last year, I think there was a way, and I apologize for my limited technical understanding, but I think there was a way of making documents accessible, like on the Hangouts, on the Hangout screen to everyone. Does anyone know how to do this?
If you post it in the classroom,
If I
people
place
will
it
be
in
able to download it. Or if you just wanna, you could screen share, or I've just sent it in the sidebar. I'm just gonna send, I just need to, I'll put a link that people will be able to check on it, because I don't think that will see. Okay. Yeah, people should be able to check that syllabus now. Oh, Ray, you're muted.
Yeah, we've got we've got 4 weeks on Marx. We've just done Feuerbach, then the next 4 sessions will be on Marx. Next week will be the thesis on Feuerbach and the German ideology. The following week, which is week 3, will be on the economic and philosophical manuscripts, the Grundrisse, and the preface to a critique of political economy. I mean, that's a lot, but unfortunately, we have to kind of try to move quite fast. But I'll prepare handouts for all these sessions. And in week 4, then we start on Capital Volume 1 in week 4. And then we continue with Capital Volume 1 in week 5. And then the final 3 weeks we look at the secondary readings. On week 6, we'll look at Lukács, Reification in the Consciousness of the Proletariat. In week 7, we'll do Althusser, Contradiction and Overdetermination, and his contribution to reading Capital. And then finally, in week 8, we'll look at 2 papers from the edited collection on Hegel's Logic and Marx's Capital, edited by Tony Smith. And we'll look at Smith's Hegel, Marx and the Comprehension of Capitalism, and Chris Arthur's Marx, Hegel and the Value Form. All the readings I've uploaded onto Dropbox, and I will share the link. If I think I've got everyone's email, so I'll share the link to the Dropbox folder containing all the readings with everyone, so that everyone has access. Has anyone? And yes, and basically, yeah, the primary texts we're looking, all the excerpts from Marx are in Karl Marx Selected Writings, edited by David McClellan. The second edition from 2000, published by Oxford University Press, except for the German ideology, which we'll use a separate edition, because there's passages which are not included in the McClellan volume, which I want to include in a discussion. And then, all the other readings are in, all the Marx readings are in the McClellan, and the secondary texts are all available as PDFs or as ebooks, actually, in the Dropbox folder. Any questions about the structure of the syllabus?
Maybe sort of look at how each of these readings relate to people's conceptions of the early humanistic Marx in relation to like the later scientific Marx and like the material Marx and stuff like that. Oh, You've been muted, I think. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yes. I mean, the key, what humanism, I mean, look, so Althusser, for instance, famously kind of insists that, Marx is, by the time he's writing Capital, Marx has rejected his early kind of, Feuerbachian / Hegelian humanism. That's a controversial claim, which, I'm kind of skeptical of. But we'll see. I mean, with Lukács, we'll have a very Hegelian interpretation of Marx. With Althusser, we have a very kind of anti-Hegelian interpretation. So understanding, in a way that, what's at stake in these kind of Hegelian and anti-Hegelian interpretations is important. But also, what people mean by humanism, I think, needs to be kind of carefully scrutinized, because I think there's a lot of confusion about what humanism is and what it actually entails. And also, as far as, the scientificity of Marx's, later texts, well, Althusser interprets this scientificity in terms of like, what he calls structuralism. But I think, this alleged, look, like other, in a way, it's not, Marx uses the German term Wissenschaft, okay? He said for science, that's the kind of the term for science, Wissenschaft. But when Marx is talking about science in this sense, I mean, Wissenschaft is also the term used by, philosophers like Fichte and Hegel to describe their own systems. In a way, so the sense in which, Marx's historical materialism, as kind of outlined in Capitalism, is scientific, is itself, complicated, because it's certainly not scientific in the sense of natural science. So Marx is, he doesn't see himself as a natural scientist. And whatever the science of history is, it's not a science like that is modeled on the natural math, or kind of mathematized natural science. But then in what sense is it a science? And in what sense is it a science as opposed to merely kind of a philosophical speculation? Because in a way, the systematicity of Marx's analysis in Capital, has a kind of Hegelian structure. When he famously insists that his method, is inspired by Hegel. So in a way, there's a sense in which scientificity can be understood to just mean conceptual systematicity. But that kind of a systematicity has long been espoused by philosophers. And if it goes beyond this ideal of this abstract conception of systematicity, what is it? What is scientific about this method? In what sense is dialectic scientific? That's one of the questions that we have to ask. And notoriously, anti-Marxists, are, kind of always enthusiastically ridiculing the claim that, anything that can be, anything dialectical could possibly be scientific. So we will be, I hope that by the end of the course we'll have, gained some traction upon these issues, but these are complicated issues. And I think, the contrast between, the scientific and the philosophical, or between the humanist and the anti-humanist is, I think we need to be careful. You can't simply take these kind of contrasts for granted. They're kind of, they're ideologically overdetermined by certain kind of theoretical conjunctures. Okay? Althusser's diatribes against humanism are often kind of polemics against the French Communist Party and against its Stalinism. That's often what he means by humanism. So again, it's we have to be clear about what these terms mean. And scientificity is another term that I think.
Can I propose something?
Yes.
Perhaps you know of the existence of the mathematical manuscript.
Yes, I haven't read them, but I know of them. Yes.
Yeah, we can read them or maybe comment them on lesson. Sorry.
Yes, I mean, what? Well, except well,
Because
I can take a look at them. Yeah.
Because Marx meant science in a way that is not just systematicity.
Okay.
And it was interesting exercise.
Sure. But in what sense is mathematization kind of is that the only sense of scientificity beyond systematicity?
No, of course.
Because there's no mathematics in capital.
There's no mathematics.
I mean, there's no kind of, you know, or the rudimentary equations hardly count as kind of, it's not mathematical formalization.
Yeah, somebody tried.
It's not the kind of mathematics that would impress any mathematician.
But somebody tried.
Can I intervene here?
Yeah, sorry.
Could be what you're trying to get at is so Method Pohl talks about this in his book Continuity and Rupture, and his notion of scientific is something that develops, morphs, and changes over time in relation to new studies, study research, and new information that comes into the system. Is this what you're trying to mode? Is this what you're trying to say is Marx's understanding of the scientific?
Yes. First of all, even within the philosophy of science, what, you know, attempts to kind of to characterize science or to define scientificity in terms of a method have all, you know, kind of failed. So it's very difficult to pin down, you know, what exactly kind of is, you know, constitutive of scientific thinking or scientific theorizing. I mean, there are basic, you know, a few kind of broad kind of, you know, family resemblance characteristics. So yes, I think all I want to say is that basically, I think often Marx is using the term polemically, as opposed to, in other words, he thinks that, you know, kind of philosophy, a certain kind of philosophy is kind of has become redundant, and in fact, it's not just redundant. If, you know, kind of philosophy is kind of has assumed a kind of reactionary function. So I think that when I think part of what's at stake in the contrast between the scientificity that he espouses or proclaims for his own thinking and the philosophy that he kind of disparages is that, you know, he thinks that philosophy is just a kind of reactionary ideology, and science is actually trying to kind of, you know, to penetrate to, you know, a reality, you know, behind appearances, which can't simply be conceptually grasped. It's all important is that you can't just, you know, you can't, you know, understand how the world works or what is going on, or what you know, the structure of social reality through a kind of a series of deductions and inferences. So I think that's, and although Marx is not an empiricist, but obviously he drew on empirical data, you know, in a extraordinary kind of, you know, fruitful way. So I think that the relationship between, so yes, I'm saying that the sense in which Marx exposes scientificity is kind of complicated. I think there's not just one sense in which he sees himself as a scientist, as opposed to kind of a philosopher. And no, I think he takes mathematics very seriously, and I think, I mean, I haven't read his mathematical notebooks, and I'm sure, you know, I'm not sure they're incredibly important and significant, and I'm happy to to bring them in. But I'd need to, or actually, if anyone has any suggestions for specific passages or segments from them, which would be really important, I'd be happy to to add them to the to the syllabus or the reading. But right now it's just right now, because I don't know them, I'm not in a position to kind of say which parts of them are most relevant.
Okay, I think we stop.
Okay.
Okay.
Um,
Do you have Matthew's email?
Let me just quickly check. No, I don't see it on the list on the email that just went out. I've got the emails for William, Meredith, Artem, Bruce, David, Rachel, Jean-Paul, John, and Victor, but I don't have Matthew's email.
Okay, can I post it on the chat?
Sure, yes.
Okay.
Okay, I'm just going to copy it. Great, thanks. So Matthew, should I send? Is this for the a copy of the syllabus, or is this about the Marx, the mathematical notebooks issue? Just can you remind me?
It's just for the syllabus.
Just for the syllabus. Okay, I'll just send it to him right now then.
Okay.
Okay. Great. Thanks very much.
Okay. See you.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Have a good weekend.
Bye.
Bye.